As we continue examining the characteristics of effective negotiators, our next speaker, Harland Cleveland, can offer insights based on his experiences in several successful careers as a foreign aid administrator, ambassador to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, dean of the Maxwell Graduate School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, and president of the University of Hawaii. He also served as Secretary of State for International Organizations under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. In that role, he played an important part in the negotiations surrounding several international conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
As far as getting things done, bringing people together in organizations to make something happen, which is my definition of an executive, the key change in the environment for being an executive, I think, is this horizontalness of relationships. That is to say that the era when Grandpa was in charge of the grocery store and he knew everything and he gave orders is gone, and it's gone precisely because of bigness and complexity. That is to say, things are so complicated that no one person can possibly know enough to give orders. So what does he do? Well, he has to call a meeting. He has to get together with some other people. And most of those other people don't work for him. Or even if they are part of his organization, he can't treat them as subordinates and get the most out of them. I was president of a university system, and people downtown would keep saying, why do you let that silly professor say those silly things in the newspapers? And say, listen, it may be hard for you to believe, but that professor doesn't think he's working for me, and I don't think he's working for me either. We're colleagues in an intellectual enterprise. But it isn't only in universities that this is the case. It's true in hospitals. Does the doctor think he's working for the hospital administrator? No, he thinks he's working for the patient, or maybe for the third-party payer. And even in a supposedly hierarchical organization, such as a corporation or a government agency, the collegial style is more and more creeping in. You'll find if you move among the upper military echelons, you'll find a major general saying something like this to a lieutenant. Lieutenant, don't you think that it'd be better to do it this way? Now, a lieutenant knows that's an order, but the style is already collegial, you see. Mm-hmm. So this is something that's happening, and I wouldn't argue that a Marine platoon isn't a more vertical organization than an urban hospital. They're the two ends of my spectrum. But I would argue that both are moving toward a more collegial style, so that a person, in order to operate in that environment, is in effect negotiating all the time.
Is this also true between organizations, say as in labor management negotiations, or between nation states?
Yeah, even more so, because so, as the lawyers say, a fortiori. If you have to be collegial even with your so-called subordinate, you certainly have to be collegial with people with whom you are in lateral relationships, because they're another sovereign country, or because they have an organization that can stop your factory from working in the end if the negotiation isn't successful. And more, as the number and complexity of the veto groups multiplies in our society, the central executive have the dilemma of how do you get everybody in on the act but still get some action? That doesn't take less executive drive. In fact, I would argue that it takes a whole lot more drive and more homework and more intellectual effort on the part of the executive to drive that kind of a system than it does to sit at the top of the pyramid, in which you can whack up pieces of the business to be done in a clear way. The trouble is that you can't whack up pieces of it. It's a system. And I've come so that I really don't like the word organization anymore, because the word system implies this horizontalness of relationships where we pass the business among ourselves, but none of us has a clear responsibility for any piece of it, and all of us have to understand the whole process of which we're a part.
Harland, under increasing horizontalness and the growing interdependence between managers, between organizations, and between nations, how do executives and negotiators deal with value conflicts and differences in ethical standards?
Because of the horizontalness, because we've created, in effect, a nobody-in-charge society. Nobody's in charge of the United States. Nobody's in charge of the world. In fact, we didn't want anybody to be in charge of the world. That's what we fought Hitler and Stalin about. But in a nobody-in-charge system, everybody's partly in charge. And that means that you and I, if we're executives in our society, in a sense have to have our own ethical standards and our own policies, our own sense of direction. And yours may be a little bit different from mine. In fact, everybody's is going to be a little bit different from everybody else's because of the way they grew up and the experiences they've had, and what they've read and so on. So you're in a constant process of negotiating with other people, trying to marry not so much the values. The important thing is not that you and I agree on an ideology, say, or a set of values. The important thing is that we can get together and take a next step, which both of us regard as consonant with our values, even though our values may be different. I think it's probably fair to say that one of the main things that we've learned about human beings dealing with each other in the history of mankind is precisely that people can come to an agreement on a next step to take together if they carefully avoid trying to agree on why they're agreeing. That is, on the value systems that motivate them, because they may be contradictory.
Are executives or negotiators having to view the use of power differently? Are there new limitations on the use of power?
Well, yes, because the mood about an organization throwing its weight around has shifted so. A business can't say, as a famous businessman once did, the public be damned. A government agency can't act as if we're working for it. You know, they're public servants, they have to work, they have to act as if they're working for us, the people. From the president on down, the newspapers are full of people that the rest of us think of as very powerful, saying things that are extremely deferential to us. Now, I've been in several substantial executive jobs, as you've noted. I was always struck by the fact that my friends and family and outside people that I knew and so forth regarded me as very powerful. You know, that I was spending all these millions of dollars and had all these big staff. I was constantly wandering around the world doing things that were important and occasionally got in the newspapers and so on. That looked like power. But that wasn't the way it looked to me. I was mostly conscious of the enormous amount of restraint that there was. I couldn't do anything without clearing it with 6 other people. I finally concluded on kind of a paradoxical conclusion about this feeling of powerfulness or powerlessness, that the higher you go in rank and in hierarchical rank, the more constraints you have. So that you get the extreme situation in which the man who mows the lawn on the White House grounds makes more policy decisions than the president, because at his level, taking Appleby's definition of policy as the decisions that are made at your level and higher, decisions that are made at his level, you know, how high to leave the grass today and which corner to mow first, and those are policy questions for that fellow. He does those without any review. But the president doesn't make any such decisions without talking to 100 people who think it's really their job to make those decisions for him. and who would resent it if they're not consulted.
You've written several books on the nature of power, two books called Ethics and Bigness and The Ethic of Power, and a more recent book called The Obligations of Power. What are some of the ethics of an executive or a negotiator? What are some of the ethical issues that an executive or a negotiator must confront in the use of power?
Well, I think mainly it is not to outrage his ultimate bosses, even though a businessman will tell you that he's working for a board of directors, most of whom he may have selected, or ultimately will say he's responsible to his stockholders. The fact is, he's really responsible to people in general. And whenever a business firm so outrages the people's sense of what's right at that moment in time that they are prepared to act, they will act through their government to regulate. That's what created the Food and Drug Administration. That's what created the Public Utility Holding Company Act. That's what the oil industry is experiencing. That's what government has experienced, partly as a result of recent unpleasantnesses. And it is quite literally true, I think, in our society that the ultimate court of appeal is a very complex collection of publics. And it's very important for the executive not to have all of them mad at him at the same time. In fact, again, reverting to Paul Appleby, the philosophers of public administration, he used to say there were 4 questions that an executive should ask himself before he does anything. Who's going to be mad? How mad? Who's going to be glad? How glad?
Harland, do you have any guidelines on how managers and negotiators use their leverage to have maximum impact?
One of the things that's most difficult for a person coming into the role of general manager from being a specialist is to understand the degree to which it's important for him not to hold in reserve whatever clout he has, whether his clout is his prestige or his money or his staff or whatever.
Can you recall any example from your own experience where you've had to apply this?
Well, every time you deal with Congress from the executive branch, you're negotiating about some piece of legislation or how much money you're going to get for the next year and so on. When you go up to testify, you obviously know a lot more about your subject than anybody else in the room. And the temptation sometimes of the expert executive appearing before a congressional committee is to answer every question in in great detail to show how much he really knows about this thing. But in fact, that isn't the most effective way of dealing with a congressional committee, because they may take that to be a put down by a fellow who is trying to show how much more he knows about it than they do. And people don't do what you'd like them to do if you've gotten them resentful for some reason like that. So that's a case of
and you've actually
holding yourself in reserve. I remember starting to do that when I was a very young government official. I was answering a question from one of the other congressmen on the committee, and the chairman was John Rooney of Brooklyn, leaned over and said in kind of a stage whisper, "Listen, you don't need to answer anything more than 2 sentences." So I think that's, you see people coming up in situations like that with, full of charts and 4-color demonstrations and so forth.
There must be some other element that's involved in it.
Well, it's the personal relationship. And it's the sort of the level of discourse that emphasizes the personal relationship. I remember a time when, after several days of hearings where we had been snowing the House Foreign Affairs Committee with charts and so forth about foreign aid, somebody had the bright idea that we should bring up as a witness a man who had been out developing seed corn in the Shan states of Burma, who had been a county agent, agricultural county agent in Kentucky. He came in with kind of baggy suit on. He reached into one of his jacket pockets and pulled out a handful of seed corn, started talking about how, with not more seed corn than that, it had been possible to develop a whole broom industry in the Shan states. Well, it was that testimony that morning that got us the money, not all the charts. They were absolutely hanging on his every word, because he was talking about something, half of them were people who had grown up on farms or near farms or in rural areas. It was a very important lesson for me, again, as a young civil servant at that time. You know, I worked for a while in Asia, and I was struck by the fact that in most of the rest of the world, and especially in Asia, the content of the conversation between two people is largely the electricity between the two personalities. In our case, maybe 3/4 of what's going on in a conversation between me and you is we're focusing on the substance of what we're talking about. But if you and I were Chinese, maybe 1/4 would be the substance, and 3/4 would be the indirection, the signals, the getting to know you, in the words of the song from The King and I. You hear all sorts of stories about this. In Indonesia, somebody tried to describe this to me once with this story. They said a young man falls in love with a girl, and so of course the mother of the young man has to go and call on the mother of the girl, because the girl is of a higher class than the boy, to raise the question as to whether they could get married. They sit down, and of course she doesn't raise the question right away. We wouldn't even in our more direct culture. We say a few pleasantries and so on, so tea is served. And with the tea, banana is served. In that particular culture, you don't serve fruit with tea. So, tea is finished, the question is still never raised. The mother of the boy gets up and takes her leave. She's got the signal. Just as fruit is not served with tea, your boy doesn't go with my girl. She never even had to discuss the subject. That's a society of indirection. Now, we do a little of this sort of thing ourselves. If I call you up on the telephone and I don't say at least hello, and maybe how are you, or maybe even how's your family, although I don't really care so much about that, but if I get to my subject in less than 30 seconds, you're going to have a certain amount of cultural shock, and you're maybe going to be less willing to do whatever it is I want you to do. So I think it would be good exercise, even for very direct, business-like American negotiators, to study a little bit what it's like in a society of indirection in some of the other cultures. Most of our procedures are too square, too formal, too much written down. We vote too much, for example, instead of operating by consensus.
You've made a strong point about consensus and as a very important method of decision making that's needed in our new complex organizations.
The more complex it is, the more ambiguities there are, the better it is not to try to squeeze the whole subject into two opposing propositions that you then divide the house on. Since the purpose of the exercise, if you have a group of people gathered together trying to solve some problem, is to bring the people together to solve the problem, not to take a picture of their disagreements. But we don't even know the first thing about this. The first thing we do is we have a meeting at a rectangular table where the very act of coming into the room requires you to take sides. Who are you going to sit with? Whose side are you on? The Chinese have forgotten more about this than we ever will learn, maybe. It wouldn't occur to them to have a negotiation around such a table. They would have it around a round table with food and drink.
Harland's comments on the importance of understanding the nonverbal signals and dynamics of negotiations is shared by many professional negotiators. Our next speaker, Hank Culero, is one of the nation's leading negotiating specialists and an expert in understanding those critical but subtle elements in negotiations, how to read body language and other types of nonverbal communications, understanding the hidden meanings behind common expressions used in the negotiating process, and how negotiating styles can communicate different messages. Hank, as president of CM Associates and as an AMR Charter faculty member, has for many years both conducted negotiating seminars for managers and executives and has served as a professional negotiator. I interviewed Hank in his home in Ojai, California, and during the conversation asked if he would identify what he felt to be the characteristics of effective negotiators.
I had a client a few days ago that called me and said, Hank, I want you to tell me who the best 5 negotiators are so that I can hire them. And I said, I can't tell you that. He was very indignant. And he said, what? He said, all right, if you can't tell me who the 5 best negotiators are, he says, I want you to train the 5 best negotiators for me. I said, I can't do that either. And that was upsetting to him too, realizing the amount of work that I've done in researching and seminars is he thought I could just magically turn 5 people into 5 successful negotiators. And he said to me, you don't know very much today, do you? And I said, well, I'll tell you what I can do for you. I can tell you some of the elements that would make 4 successful negotiators. And then you make the selection. But negotiators, per se, are not born and they're not trained this way. They develop into over a process of time. So then we look at what some of the elements are. We have to, first, I'd say the number one thing a negotiator has to have is he has to be aware. Awareness, a high degree level. He has to know what's going on. He has to see what's happening. He has to be perceptive enough to, and intuitive enough to sense when an individual is saying to them, I like what you're saying, I don't like what you're saying, you better stop, it's time to terminate, it's time to caucus. That type of word.
Mm-hmm. There's a sensitivity to group process. Is that part of what you're saying?
Absolutely. You know, the individual that's aware of how the individual or group is reacting to what he or she is saying. So first, awareness. The negotiator has to have the high degree of awareness. Another factor is the negotiator has to be patient. Has to be patient. That's why an awful lot of negotiators don't maximize their efforts, because they get into the ritual of negotiating. And that might be another interesting thing to talk about later, the basic ritual. There is a ritual, and it is pretty structured. And the more you negotiate, the more you realize how you go from one step to the other. But the individual has to have a high level of frustration and be able to cope with the time that it takes, with the way people behave, with the way things don't work out. And it's taken me a long time to realize what patience is, you know. It's simply frustration under control. And another, I think, factor that successful negotiators have to have, they have to be flexible. Mm-hmm. They have to be flexible. They have to be able to change their negotiating styles when they're not working. They have to be able to change and change alternatives and options, and never be fearful of doing that, as opposed to being very rigid. The negotiators that concern me the most are the ones that are inflexible. They try something, and if it doesn't work, they don't know what else to do.
What makes a person inflexible? Is it rigid values or rigid stereotypes of people, or?
Well, I suspect there are a majority of things, a lot of things, but I would think one very important thing is the desire to want to win. The desire to want to win. The desire to be right all the time. And I think that's very strong.
To win completely, in other words.
Yes, exactly, and not give. To get everything, never to give. To be right, never to be wrong. Not to be able to say, I don't know, which comes very difficult to some people, you know, or I was wrong. I think those are the makings of rigidity.
Is that basically an authoritarian personality?
No, I've seen many individuals that were not authoritarian. On the contrary, I think many authoritarian individuals, you see that one side of them. When they feel that's the side of them you should see, and very equally can switch over to another style or another mode of negotiating. So it's not just primarily authoritarian. I would say people maybe that are very insecure sometimes have a tendency of being very inflexible because they're fearful, or they have a high fear failure ratio. So that might be some other. But negotiators, to be successful, have to have the element of being flexible.
Does that also mean style flexibility?
Oh, yes.
In other words, not only your positions, but also being able to use different types of styles of negotiating?
Absolutely. They're being able to be, as you say, dominating one situation, very controlling, and in another situation being very supportive, and another situation being very much oriented towards acquiring facts, and in another being very adaptable and using a lot of humor and so forth. And being able to go through one style to another one. You know, successful salesmen will do that real well, you know. They start out by telling you a little story or inquiring on your health or your vacation, and then when they got that social amenities out of the way, then they start going into, I tell you what I'm going to do, and they tell you all this great and glorious services and products they have, which are supporting to your needs or creating you. Then they give you all the data information, which then they become very, and then finally they become controlling, taking, and say, do you want Carlo, the pink ones or blue ones? Or, you want to sign now or after lunch? Do they not do those things?
That's very true.
So
very true.
So they have to be flexible. They have to be flexible to styles. They have to be being rigid. Forces oneself into an either-or situation. And I don't know. I didn't know whether this was going to come up during the course of our conversation. But one very, very important factor that makes for a successful negotiator, he's learned a long time ago that either-or are killing situations. That paint people into corners. And therefore he has learned to say if-then in place of either-or. And just stop for a moment and think. There's a world of difference between if-then and either-or. If-then allows people to change. You say if Ed, you persist in the position you are, then it appears that the only alternative that I have is such and such. And I give you the opportunity of moving. Rather than saying either you do such and such, or I'll do such and such, which more or less commands you, forces you in a position.
You're talking about different ways of making demands.
Yes, I guess that's, yes.
One sounds like a demand, the other one sounds like a threat.
Or possibly that may be clarifying positions and allowing the other person to move. Because I've had people say sometimes, if you persist in such and such, then my course of action will be so and so. And sometimes people back off and say, well, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't realize it came across that strong. In essence, saying, let's negotiate. I've also recalled from my experiences, sadly enough, when I used either or, it didn't work. People sometimes said, well, the hell with you, if that's the way you feel about it.
Are there any conditions can you identify the conditions when to use either or?
Well, I would say that try if-then situations, because if-then is negotiating. Either-or is confronting, and there's a difference. I would say go into situations, if you do go in with the idea of negotiating, then use words if-then. And finally, if you're unsuccessful and you want to confront situations, then your fallback position is either-or, rather than the other way around. A person is always much more successful attempting to negotiate and then using his confrontation as a fallback than the other way around. Well, then, touching very quickly on some of the other things to answer your question about what these profiles might be, is that the individual, again, to touch on creativity, the person has to be creative. He has to be able to use both ways of thinking, vertically and laterally. The individual has to be a good listener. And negotiators, by and large, are not very good listeners. They're just not very good listeners.
What are the barriers to effective listening?
Well, I think probably a major one is time sharing. To use computer language talk for a moment, since we have the ability to perceive so much more words than the person utters, we go into time sharing, and we time share about what's going on in the office, at home, and why the person's saying, or it's at best kind of a polite listening, waiting for the other person to interrupt, to talk so that you can interact. And see, the overly aggressive tendency sometimes that individuals have and they feel that the negotiation is a confrontation. Let me tell you this now. By the same token, on the other hand, to use some meta-talk expressions, where a person's, and then of course lastly is but. You know, but tends to be the English eraser. Yes, I agree with what you said, Ed, but. It tends to erase everything. Yeah. I don't want to make, I know it's none of my business, but, and then, so the individual oftentimes listens in this mode. And so the successful negotiator has to recognize that Shakespeare said it so beautifully, much better than I can. He who listens is armed.
Hank, in one of the seminars that you presented, I heard you talk about listening in the same time frame as the person speaking. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, absolutely. You were a good listener. You were listening well. Indeed, there's some new work that I'm doing that is quite interesting and intriguing, and that's simply that human beings all over the world talk in 3 different time frames. They talk about what happened yesterday or in the past tense. They talk about what's happening today or the present tense, and they talk about what's going to happen tomorrow in the future tense. And as a result of that, if you can learn to find out what tense the person's coming from, or they're speaking in, it gives you a great advantage. It also forces you to concentrate, to listen better. And then, furthermore, in negotiating conflict situations, if you can respond to them in the same time frame, you tend not to irritate them. They tend to sense that he understood what I said. He understood. He grasped the meaning. But if you don't answer them in the same time frame, they tend to sense that you don't care. You're not interested. You've turned a deaf ear, as the expression goes. I think you remember the example that I used where in a work situation you said to me, Hank, I went shopping yesterday, and I answered, well, I'm going to go tomorrow. That kills their conversation. But if I, to use the illustration, if I had been listening in the same time frame and responded, I would have said, you did? Did you buy anything? And then I might have said, I'm going to go shopping tomorrow. And
yes.
I could have bridged that.
There's a world of difference.
Yeah. And at the negotiating table, after recording so many hundreds, literally thousands of negotiations, role-played situations on videotape, it's amazing how many people turn each other off because they do not listen in the same time frame or don't respond in the same time. It irritates them.
Are there any techniques or guidelines that you use to determine whether or not a person has heard what you said?
The technique that I use is by finding out whether they're responding in my time frame.
Okay.
You find that, for example, our interview here, and you've become and are a very good interviewer because you're constantly tracking me in the time frame, or you're leading me to the time frame that you want to be. But in no one's instance have you irritated me because of doing this. It's a very capable style of getting people around to where you want to be without them having to get angry at you. But you got to work at it, and you got to know what you're doing.
Okay.
So, and then lastly, one other exercise that, besides the one that you just brought out about the time framing, is to learn to tilt your head to one side when listening, which automatically forces you to listen. Because you see, you can't speak with your head tilted to one side. That's the listening position. That's the talking position. The only person that talks with the head tilted to one side is the one that has a crick in the neck. And many successful salesmen who have learned to know when to listen.
What's my body language doing now?
Yes, well, you're listening, you're evaluating. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, your mind is going very fast. The bridge on the next time.
Very good, Hank. Any other points?
Well, a couple other things I think a successful negotiator should have. He should be very persistent. He should be persistent, and that is, he should continue with alternatives, not giving up. If you try something else. The individual should also, I think, become win-win oriented. Because after all, negotiating is a process of satisfying needs, and everybody's going to get something out of it. So if he goes into it with the idea of that notion, his high success ratio is going to be higher than one goes in with, I'm going to get everything and give up nothing.
Life, as someone once said, is just one damn thing after another. To paraphrase that expression, perhaps life is just one negotiation after another. And if that is true, it becomes important for all of us to examine our attitudes and capabilities in negotiating around the bargaining table, in our professional lives, and with our families and friends. Our speakers have raised several questions in my mind that we will examine throughout the program, which each of us have to consider in strengthening our effectiveness as negotiators. First, if leverage is critical in negotiations, what are my attitudes and skills in acquiring and using different types of negotiating leverage? Am I more comfortable and successful developing leverage through building trust and openness with others, gaining leverage through building personal relationships? Or do I gain leverage because of my expertise? Do I use information and facts to influence and persuade? Or am I more successful with the graceful use of power, knowing how to build economic and political clout, but realizing that power has certain constraints and must be used responsibly? Another characteristic of effective negotiators is their capability to use a variety of styles and strategies, being tough but flexible, having high aspirations but avoiding win-lose confrontations. So it's important to ask if my negotiating styles are generally successful, or if the pattern of my styles carry any liabilities. Am I able to collaborate, compromise, or confront depending on the situation? Another question, do I know the rules of the game? There are certain rituals that are a part of negotiations that take place in Congress, in our organizations, and in our homes that effective negotiators know and follow and realize the penalties to their credibility and leverage if these rules are broken. Finally, effective negotiators are skilled in understanding and being able to influence the subtle dynamics of negotiations. They are aware of what's happening, what types of influence are being used, and they have a high degree of self-control. So it's important to assess myself in a whole range of negotiating skills. How do I deal with anger and intimidation? How skilled am I in getting others to openly share problems and conflicts, coming up with alternatives, and settling differences through bargaining? Am I patient and skilled at decoding those subtle, hidden, nonverbal messages that are so often critical in negotiations? As I reflected on the characteristics of effective negotiators, I noticed their similarity with those men and women whom John Gardner, in his book Self-Renewal, saw as having the attitudes and capabilities to meet the challenges and grow both in their personal and professional lives, being open, motivated, flexible, objective, creative, courage to fail, tolerant, having a high degree of commitment and meaning in their lives. And Gardner, I think, very nicely summed up the rewards of those who strive for this type of excellence. Some individuals look forward and have the future ever in mind. Others are preoccupied with the past. The former have a vivid sense of what they are becoming, the latter a vivid sense of what they have been. The former are fascinated by the novelty of each day's experience. The latter have a sense of having seen everything.